From the Alvin and Rosalie Sarachek studio, PBS Kansas presents Kansas Week.
As cities across Kansas count their homeless populations this week, Wichita was asking state lawmakers for help paying for services. Plus, one election bill, two election bills, three. How many is too many in an election year? Depends on who you ask. But first, a bipartisan demand for more information on a Kansas newspaper raid that made international headlines. That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week. This is Kansas Week, and I'm your host, Pilar Pedraza. We begin today with breaking news. Just before we sat down to record this episode, word came down Governor Laura Kelly has vetoed the Republican tax plan bill. The Senate President and Speaker of the Kansas House held an unusual public signing of the bill earlier this week before sending it to the governor, urging her to add her signature and make it law. It includes a lot of items she has in her own tax plan. Ending all taxes on Social Security benefits, accelerating the end of state-level sales taxes on groceries, and cutting property taxes among them. But the main component of the Republican bill was moving Kansas to what the governor calls a flat tax, and Republican leadership is calling a dual tax rate system. Zero tax on up to $6,150 of income and 5.25% tax on any income after that. The governor had vowed during her State of the State address earlier this month to veto any flat tax plans, saying they're unfair to middle-income Kansans who would get no benefit. Republicans say they do benefit in the other provisions of the bill, making up for the lack of income tax benefits. Friday's veto sets up an override fight, most likely in the Senate first, where three conservative senators have publicly come out in support of the governor's plan. Now joining us today to tackle this and much more, we have State Representative Stephen Owens, a Hesston Republican, and former State Representative Jim Ward, a Wichita Democrat. Thank you both for being here. And this wasn't what we were expecting to talk off the top of the show. It was like half of last week's show, but we were talking before we started recording. This veto, not a surprise for anybody.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I was going to say it's the timing might have been a little surprising, but certainly not the outcome.
Yeah, it kind of seems like they had enough time for the bill to hit her desk and the veto pen was already out.
Well, she let everyone know early on when she heard the details of the Republican plan that this was a non-starter, and we had done this all last year. So it's not like, oh my gosh, we're just starting tax. This is a 2-year debate, and the sides are pretty dug in at this point.
And very much so. I sat in on the floor debate in the Senate, which was really kind of the one that was in question, whether it was even going to pass the first time there. Definitely a question on the override. Now, in the original votes, there was not an override majority in either the House or the Senate. But for you guys, it was more about absences than defections.
Yeah, when you look at the numbers, I think we were down 4 Republicans that day, and we're confident that they would have supported it. So we're very confident going into the House. As you are well aware, in years past, we've batted better than about 75% in overriding the governor. So we're pretty confident we're going to be able to accomplish that in the House.
So a good chance that they'll run it through the Senate first, because that's where we've got Dennis Pyle, who's an independent conservative, Rob Olson, who's a Republican from Eastern Kansas, and John Dahl, a Republican who has been an independent before from Western Kansas, all who have said at this point that they support the governor's plan.
Well, and also 2 of those 3 have announced that they are retiring or moving on to the next phase of their life. So that gives them a little more independence to exercise what they think is best for their district. So I think the Senate leadership has a high hill to climb to get to that magic 27, 2/3 of the Senate. I'd be surprised if any of them flip based on what they've said and done, and then the fact that there's not a lot of leverage left for Senate leadership.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, to me, we've got to remember that Kansans need tax relief. They needed tax relief a year ago, and we had the chance to have no food sales tax as of today. We've had the chance. We've been down this road. And so there were actually some changes made in this plan that brought it more to the middle of the road as Governor Kelly requested. And still, immediately, without question, there's no veto. So to me, it's become apparent that it's not her top priority to cut taxes for Kansans.
I would disagree, okay? We're talking about the difference between $1.6 billion, which is the price tag on the Republican plan, that hits schools twice. It reduces the total amount of money going into the general fund that it's schools get about a third to 50% if you include higher ed. And it specifically cuts the 20 mil property tax because it raises the value of homes that would reduce the amount of money generated. Schools get hit twice. So the governor's plan is about $1 billion. So it's about a $500 million difference. The governor's plan, as Democrats typically do, focuses more on property tax cuts and some of the middle class cuts. The flat tax, I think even the representative would agree, overwhelmingly benefits rich, affluent Kansans, similar to the Brownback plan. And we know what happens when you take that chunk of income out of the revenue stream. Schools are hurt, roads get the bank of KDOT is what we used to call it, and we aren't able to meet our demands of our service industry. So I think there's a big, not only political, but a belief on how you should cut taxes and how much you should cut taxes.
And that was the return to the Brownback years was one of the big arguments that conservatives, Pyle and Olson, were making during the debate in the Senate.
You know, which is fascinating. You mentioned a $1.6 billion number, which is exactly how much the governor's proposed to increase spending this year in her budget. And so there is truly an imbalance when you want to cut taxes. And by the way, our tax plans are about $100 to $150 billion different. Excuse me, $150 million annually, something like that. The difference is not significant between what she wants and what we want. There is a significant difference in how much we're spending. You mentioned schools, though, and that increased property tax exemption. Just because we're increasing the property tax exemption, the Republicans have never failed to not fund schools in the last 5 or 6 years. So I do not envision that being a problem.
I would agree, but it was based on the shotgun that the Supreme Court put between our eyes. It said, you will fund schools, and they outlined what they expected. And to our credit, we had reached across party lines and put together a 5-year funding plan that met the demands of schools and children, as well as the Supreme Court. And that 5 years is up. And now it's a question of what's next, because as you know, and Pilar, everything costs more now than it did 5 years ago. We could argue about why,
right,
but the bottom line is it costs more to hire teachers, it costs more to buy books, it costs more to pay for utilities in schools. And so that is, I hope, a conversation the legislature has this year. But if you take $1.6 billion out of the pot, it's going to make it harder.
I find it interesting you bring that up because there is actually a bill that was introduced this last week that would eliminate the Special Education Task Force and replace it with just an education funding task force. So I think that move of we need to look at this and figure it all out is the foot.
And I haven't honestly heard that. I don't sit on the education committees, although I have great confidence in the legislation that's been put forward and the conversations that we're having, because at the end of the day, we're constantly looking for better outcomes for our children. We know those scores aren't where they need to be. We know our kids are not graduating college and career ready, and we've got to constantly be looking at other alternatives and options to make that happen.
All right. Well, we're going to watch and see what happens with the veto override, and we're going to let that be the last word on the tax debate here on Kansas Week today. Meanwhile, the police raid of the Marion County Record was the raid seen around the world. Now, dozens of Kansas lawmakers have introduced a resolution formally requesting a report from the Attorney General's office on the investigation into what happened. We turn to KAKE's Eli Higgins for an explanation.
There's an ongoing chilling effect that perpetuates, that continues, as long as members of the public and the press are in the dark about whether or not what the Marion County Record did was illegal.
Tuesday, dozens of people gathered for the Wichita League of Women Voters weekly discussion. And this time, it was all about an event that put the world's eyes on Kansas. The police raid of the Marion County newspaper. Max Couch and the team at the Kansas Press Association have been working with dozens of Kansas lawmakers to draft this. A House resolution formally submitted Tuesday requesting Attorney General Chris Kobach provide a report of the investigation.
Without transparency and trust, how are the governed going to trust the government? And by the same token, how can the government believe that it has the kind of authority that it needs to promote public safety if there's no trust?
Couch says he's the first to admit that sometimes agencies need to withhold information about investigations.
What if somebody is on the lam and the media publishes that fact, and then they become aware, the defendant becomes aware, and then they leave the state and then they're never prosecuted? I mean, this can't happen. So there is a time and place when it is reasonable for law enforcement to withhold information about investigations. Absolutely.
But he says in his opinion, that time in this case has long passed.
The facts have not changed, and it's been months. And journalists in the state and journalists throughout the world need to know whether or not what the record did was legal.
A lot of questions there. A lot of questions about that investigation and where does it stand? Is it completed? Have any determinations been made? And there have been no answers forthcoming at this point. Not just from journalists, of course, we're interested because it impacts what we do, but from Kansans on the street. But at the same time, I'm wondering how much lawmakers or community leaders are hearing about it, because it has been several months since this happened.
Right, and I'd love to say I had some breaking news or some great answers for you, but I don't. We continue to ask that same question. Can we get an update? It's kind of like the white powder that we all got sent, right? Same thing. It's an ongoing investigation. We can't disseminate any information. I mean, obviously, freedom of the press is a hugely important part of our freedoms in this country, and ensuring that we have answers and that we have accountability are absolutely paramount.
Yeah.
And I would say this, we want to get it right.
Yeah.
We want to make sure, so I hope the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, who's the lead investigation, does take the time it needs. I know we all want answers.
Yeah.
You know, we would want to make sure, but we want to make sure it's right, because as the piece says, there are times where law enforcement has to investigate the media. But you have to tread very lightly because of the huge pall it puts on that concept of free. We all can say, well, I wish the press was better or did it different. Or said
No
nicer
doubt
things.
about that.
But I think we have a universal agreement that our representative democracy only works if they can do their job unafraid that political or even personal agendas prevent that. It only works if they do their job. So I want the KBI to take the time it needs to get it right, so we can send a clear message of where that line is, or at least give a much better idea where the line is.
Yeah, and there has been a non-binding, I mean, it's a non-binding resolution. It's been introduced. It was just sent to House Judiciary, and I hope that we bring that up and we really have a conversation about it. More so, it would be great if we could get some proactive answers, if now is the time and there is something that can be shared. That would even negate the need for that.
Yeah.
And I don't really, and that it's, we need to pass a law.
Right.
I think it's really coaching of law enforcement and giving them some idea where that line is when you deal with people who, you know, talk with buckets of ink or blanket airtime. You want give them the coaching where how you filter out political and personal thing and make sure you're just dealing with law enforcement issues.
Well, I will tell you, most J schools have this class called Mass Media Law 101 that we all have to take in order to get a journalism degree. I think we could probably copy and paste that into law enforcement, in my opinion.
There you go.
All right, well, how many changes should there be to the way we run elections in Kansas in a presidential election year? It all depends on who you ask. More than 28 bills in the House Elections Committee alone, dozens more in the Senate, all asking for little tweaks here and there in how Kansas operates its elections. Everything from when and where you can turn in advance ballots to several bills with different ideas of how the Secretary of State should go about double-checking that everyone on the voter rolls is legally allowed to vote and still a Kansas resident. One bill that got a hearing Thursday would block counties from sending unsolicited applications for advanced ballots. The Senate Fed and State Affairs chairman and the bill's sponsor, Mike Thompson, said it was necessary because the Johnson County Elections Commissioner, appointed by Secretary of State Scott Schwab, wasted $130,000 printing and delivering some 417,000 advanced voter ballot applications. Applications no one had asked for. The Kansas Reflector reports Harvey County's election clerk, Rick Peepo, representing election clerks from around the state, told lawmakers the state shouldn't interfere with county decisions. Quote, "We believe that individual election officers should continue to have the option, based on the needs of their jurisdiction, to send unsolicited mailings to voters in their jurisdiction that include an advance ballot application," he said. And getting back to what I was talking about as we go into that piece there, not everybody agrees that we should be looking at all of these different election bills this year. When I spoke with the Secretary of State during the first week of the session, just a one-on-one conversation, he told me his agenda for this year was no changes. It's a presidential election year. That's a major election. people want to know what to expect and what they can do and how the rules are. Last minute changes to the rules make confusion for everybody. And then you add on top of that, for the first time, we've got the presidential preference primary, which there's so many questions about that people don't understand what's going on.
Since we did
Yeah.
Right.
So the question is, should we even be considering these bills this year?
Well, look, we all know how important elections are, and we know that election integrity has been in question since our Constitution and elections were created. I just finished a book about Ulysses S. Grant, and the election challenges that went on back then, right? So we know that that's a challenge, and I think we always have an obligation to review and to look at how we can make our elections more secure. Now, with that being said, I want to be clear that I believe our elections in Kansas are solid. I believe our election leaders do a fantastic job. As last I heard, we're about fourth secure elections in the nation here in Kansas. So I have tremendous confidence. However, in the House, we do have an election committee, and elections are really an important part of what we do. And so continuing to look and evaluate ideas and opportunities, I think is very important.
I think you made a good point. People know the rules. We've got a huge election this year. The Senate's up, the House is up. We're going to elect a president. So I don't think we need to change the rules. And about the piece, it's important to note about whether or not they should be sending out unsolicited applications for an advanced ballot. No requirement you send it back, but it makes sure you know you have that option. Mm-hmm. That was an agreement in Sedgwick County that was made about 10 or 15 years ago, when the election commissioner reduced the number of places people could go polling from like 250 to like 100 by a half. And he said, in exchange for that, because we know that makes it harder for voters to go vote, we will send out an application to every registered voter. And what the piece didn't, or certainly the senator who introduced this bill didn't say, of those 400,000 applications, how many got sent back, and how many got sent back by first-time advanced voters? Because that would really be the gauge. If people are using this tool, why prevent it? We should make voting easy. I want secure elections. There has been, despite, I think Chris spent 4 years as Secretary of State looking for fraud and came up with half a dozen cases. So we want to make sure the elections are secure, but the primary goal is to make sure everybody eligible gets to vote on their schedule if possible.
Yeah, and I personally like the idea that if the advanced ballots are going to be sent out, and those are the applications for an advanced ballot, to be clear, that they do come from the county election official and not from any other groups.
Yeah, I was going to say, because I know, especially in 2020, but again in 2022, we saw this happening where we had groups outside of the state that their whole purpose, they're nonprofits, their purpose is to increase voter participation, voter registration. They target folks who are in various demographics that tend to be underrepresented at the polls. But they would do the same thing. They would send out the advanced ballot application, partially filled in already. The number of people I had coming to me saying, is this fraud? Right. What's going on here? It's already got my name, my address on here, etc. There was a lot of confusion. And at the same time, the Sedgwick County Elections Commissioner at the time, she told me that they were processing because people wouldn't know. And so they're like, oh, I must not have sent it in. I better send it in. So and they would process 2, 3, 4 times for the same voter.
Right. So it causes that confusion, could potentially lead to additional ballots that don't need to be sent out. So it is. So if it is going to come, I like that it is coming from the county election officials.
All right.
Yeah, I think there's no pressing issue. There was some questions after the 2000 election with hanging chads and stuff, so there was a big push because there was identified problems. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And over years, we've tried to make it easier with the 3-day window, with the more advanced balloting, with the drop boxes. Those are all tools to make it easier for the voter. Now, we could continue vigilantly to make sure that they're secure, but the goal is to get everybody eligible, able to participate. And in today's world, you got to be able to do it. One of the biggest things we do, which is amazing, is about a week before the election, you can start to vote in polling places.
Yeah, early.
You know,
early in
those are all tools to make it easier to vote. And convenient for the voter.
Of course, you've now resurrected nightmares I'm going to be having for the next week of hanging chads, dimple chads, pregnant chads.
Poor Chad.
And a quick question is, what's the difference? Could you remember? Because there were differences.
Yes, there were.
Because some of them got counted and some of them didn't.
That's exactly
Okay,
right.
well, that was 2000. Let's come back to 2024. Wichita City Council traveled to Topeka this week, pushing their legislative agenda. Among the issues they wanted to address, affordable housing. Mayor Lily Wu told KSN News Wichita has a population, as of last year, of more than 700 unhoused individuals. She said many without a home come from outside of Wichita, and that's why the city needs help from state lawmakers with a solution: a multi-agency center for homeless advocates from the city, the county, nonprofits, and the business sector, who will all come together and work on helping folks living on the street find a home.
I believe that it's important that we encourage more of our developers to also come to the table and say, we want to be part of the solution, because right now we're lacking in housing all throughout the city of Wichita.
And that has been an issue, especially when we're talking about the unhoused and the homeless in Wichita. We've had increasing problems, and they've got this idea for this campus that they're working on, but they've been working on it for so many years. It's starting to wonder, is it really going to happen?
Well, and I think there's a $50 million proposal in the legislature, but let's make this clear. This is not a Wichita problem. This is not a Kansas City or Johnson County problem. It's a problem wherever there's large cities. If you go to Los Angeles, you go to Phoenix, you go to New York, homelessness in our country is a systemic problem. And I really want to compliment the city for stepping up and saying, this may not be the right idea, but we've got to do something. Let's start talking about how do we address the needs of people who don't have a place to, because you might have noticed the last month, it's been pretty damn cold out there. Not only so I applaud this city, and I like the fact, as my understanding is, that it's not just a grant by the state, but the city and the counties that want to use it have to match it dollar for dollar. So if you get 10 million, you got to put 10 million in yourselves. And let's see what works, because I think if we can get some homelessness, maybe we can address some of the underlying mental health issues and help these people get into a more productive life.
Because I've had conversations with various leaders in dealing with homelessness and those who have trouble with housing, that there are a lot of them who are actually dumped in the metro area, whether from Western Kansas or even from other states, because they know that the metro area has the infrastructure.
And that was actually a question that I asked Commissioner Johnson and Commissioner Hoheisel in my office earlier this week as part of that. Grateful that they took the time to come up there, but I asked that question: if you guys create this facility, are you then going to draw more homeless people to the community? And what's the plan for that? And they said, well, we're already seeing that occur, because that exact thing, the services are already here. Affordable housing is a huge challenge. Affordable housing leads to homelessness, and the cycle perpetuates itself. The state of Kansas has been very proactive. Just last year, I think we passed 5 different pieces of legislation trying to create some level of incentive, some way to offset property taxes, and different ways to incentivize builders to build. To your point, not just in Wichita or the big cities, but in rural Kansas. There's, we have businesses that want to grow, and for lack of housing, they're unable to do so.
Yeah, they've got that program in McPherson where they're doing the little house
and
neighborhood.
Liberals got a program too that they're going to develop to try to get some, and that's positive. The answer to your question to them is absolutely. Yeah. If we do this, you are going to see because we have one of the best special ed programs in the state and in the country here in 259, people come. Judges have sent people to Wichita. Now, one of the conditions is that the bus leaves at 7, and hopefully you're on it.
All right.
But that doesn't relieve our civic obligation, our moral obligation to try to address that, and then work with our rural colleagues in the House or in the Senate to see, look what liberals doing, look what Great Bend's doing. You can address this issue too, other than giving them bus tickets.
All right. Well, finally today, speaking of affordable housing, a Wichita journalism collaborative between Planeta Venus and KMUW shows while rent-to-own contracts offer Kansans a low barrier to home ownership, they're also at much higher risk of fraud. Celia Hack with KMUW Radio reports, in August 2020, the Spanish-speaking Perez Robledo family signed a contract for the home written in English, thinking they were buying it. The family spent months and thousands of dollars on repairs before moving in January 2021. But 3 months later, Perez and Robledo realized they did not, in fact, own the home. The $10,000 they paid to the sellers had not been a down payment. The contract they signed for the house was actually a lease agreement with an option to purchase, a unique payment structure similar to rent-to-own contracts. In these contracts, buyers typically rent the home for a certain amount of time with the option to buy it directly from the owner before the lease expires. In some cases, a percentage of the monthly rent actually goes toward the purchase price. The sellers might also ask for an upfront cash payment, which mimics a down payment, but doesn't necessarily guarantee equity in the house. Rent-to-own contracts mean buyers can avoid banks and credit checks, but skirting traditional lenders can be risky, as the Federal Trade Commission has warned. Perez and Robledo faced that reality when a judge ruled this fall the contract they signed was fraudulent. The sellers did not have complete ownership of the house, despite saying so in the contract. Unlike rental situations, which are governed by the Landlord-Tenant Act, Kansas has no regulations about rent-to-own, said Marty Keenan, the lawyer who represented the Perez-Robledo family in court. So it's like the Wild West. And you know what? The Wild West eventually developed rules. Maybe we need some in Kansas.
Well, I certainly think it's worth looking at. You know, this is terribly unfortunate. Nobody should have to go through this. People should be better and be more honest. The most important thing we can do is educate people and make sure they fully understand what they're signing. You can do these rent-to-own contracts or these lease-to-own contracts at a closing company. You can still go through an official closing process. Whether or not it needs additional government regulation or not, I hope to have that conversation.
Yeah. Well, and part of the issue perhaps is language barriers. A lot of the families being brought into this are Latino, Spanish-speaking families.
Well, I can't imagine that, because I know I had represented folks like Mr. Keenan who have been involved in these, and it's really difficult to make them work. I understand a low barrier to home ownership, but all of the benefits of home ownership, the deductions and the ability to fix, you don't have. And you are treated like a tenant for those. But if something goes wrong, water pipe breaks, no, you're the owner. So all of the benefits you get as a renter are gone, and all the benefits of a homeowner are gone, and you're left in the middle with the hope that the person you're buying from is honest.
Yeah.
And we could do better.
Very difficult situation. All right. Well, we're out of time. Thank you both so much, Stephen and Jim, for joining us. I hope that you've enjoyed our conversation. We'd also like to thank our news partners at KSN News, the Wichita Eagle, and Cake News for sharing their materials with us. What do you think we should be talking about? Let us know with an email. Just send it to kansasweek@kpts.org. For now, stay safe and have a great week.